Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Marcus Sterling said, standing in the break room doorway at 6:06 a.m., his Italian leather shoes reflecting the overhead fluorescence like mirrors. Not to Ashley Cooper directly. Never to her face. He said it to the 8 nurses and 3 residents clustered around the coffee station, his voice smooth as diesel fuel, his smile the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Just a nurse who thinks she can move at her own pace in my department. Ashley was not in the break room. She was 3 corridors away, in the supply closet, sitting on a plastic crate between stacks of sterile gauze and 4 bags, eating a turkey sandwich she'd made at home and wrapped in wax paper. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed like a trapped wasp. It was the only place in Sacred Heart ER where nobody looked for her. She'd worked here for 7 years. 7 years of arriving 40 minutes early, of staying 20 minutes late, of knowing where every medication was stored before the residents did. 7 years of not making eye contact with Dr. Sterling when he swept through the trauma bays in his white coat that cost more than her monthly rent, his stethoscope draped like a status symbol across his shoulders. 7 years of being invisible, and she had worked very hard to keep it that way. The sandwich tasted like nothing. That was fine. Food hadn't tasted like much of anything since 2016. Her left leg ached where she'd positioned it, old injury, old news, the kind of pain that came with weather changes and long shifts. She shifted her weight, and the crate creaked beneath her. The supply closet was 4 feet by 6 feet, windowless, lit by a single flickering fixture that hummed at a frequency that made her teeth ache if she stayed too long. It was perfect. Sacred Heart ER stretched across 8,400 square feet of controlled chaos. 12 trauma bays. 43 beds in the main department. 3 CT scanners. 1 operating theater. And somewhere in that maze of beeping monitors and rolling stretchers and the constant low hum of machines keeping people alive, Dr. Sterling was building his empire, one careful manipulation at a time. Ashley had seen his type before. Authority without wisdom. Control without competence. The kind of man who needed everyone around him to be smaller so he could feel tall. She'd learned to recognize it in military commanders, in senior officers, in the hierarchy of men who confused obedience with respect. The difference was, in the Coast Guard, those men at least understood the cost of failure. They'd seen it. Blood on tile. Names read at memorials. Flags folded and handed to widows. Dr. Sterling had never seen any of that. He'd seen quarterly reviews and hospital board meetings and the quiet resignation of good people who decided it wasn't worth fighting. She finished the sandwich. Wrapped the wax paper. Placed it in a small trash bin tucked behind a shelf of saline bags. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. Everything invisible. At 7:14 a.m., she left the supply closet and moved back into the department proper. The ER was already humming. A 34-year-old male with chest pain in Bay 7. A motorcycle accident in Bay 3, the patient was still being prepped for transport to trauma surgery. 2 elderly patients waiting for bed assignments. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something else, something underneath, the scent of human suffering that no amount of bleach ever quite erased. Ashley breathed through her mouth and moved toward her assignment board. Dr. Sterling was standing at the central station, reviewing charts, his dark hair perfectly styled, his scrub somehow still pristine at this hour. He looked up as she passed. For exactly 1 second, their eyes met. Then Ashley looked away, and her shoulders dropped 3 millimeters, a gesture so small that anyone watching would have missed it. Anyone except a predator who understood the language of submission. Dr. Sterling smiled. He'd come to Sacred Heart 3 years ago from Seattle Presbyterian, bringing with him a reputation for excellence and a talent for making people disappear, not physically, but professionally. 3 nurses had transferred out in his first 6 months. 2 residents had requested different rotations. The department chair had stopped attending staff meetings. And yet, on paper, Dr. Sterling's clinical outcomes were exceptional. His patient satisfaction scores were high. His efficiency metrics were impressive. He was, in every measurable way, exactly what Sacred Heart wanted, a physician who got results. He just got them by breaking people quietly. Ashley had recognized this on day one, which was why she'd made herself the kind of nurse he could ignore. She didn't argue about protocol. She didn't question his orders. She didn't make mistakes that required correction. She simply existed, quietly, in the background, doing her work with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory and training and the understanding that lives hung on the difference between good and adequate. The problem was, that exact behavior was starting to bother him. It was 8:22 a.m. when Ashley was restocking the medication cart in Bay 4, her movements efficient and economical, placing ampules of epinephrine in descending size order, when she heard the break room door swing open down the corridor. Dr. Sterling's voice carried through the ER like a radio transmission. "1 week," he said to the assembled staff, his tone casual, almost playful. "I'm giving the quiet one, Ashley, right, 1 week before she realizes she doesn't belong here." Ashley's hand paused for exactly half a second. An ampule of epinephrine hung between her fingers. The fluorescent light above her flickered once. "She'll quit," Dr. Sterling continued, and there was laughter in his voice now, the sound of a man who'd already won an argument nobody else knew they were having. "Mark it down. 7 days. She'll realize she can't keep up, that she doesn't fit, that working under me requires a different kind of person. Someone who doesn't flinch at criticism. Someone who understands that medicine is a hierarchy, and she's at the bottom. 8 nurses. 3 residents. The attending radiologist, probably. Maybe the nurse supervisor from the night shift, hanging around for some reason." Ashley placed the ampule in its slot. Arranged the next one. Her breathing was steady. Her hands were steady. The only indication that she'd heard anything at all was the slight tightening of her jaw, the smallest muscle contraction that most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. And Dr. Sterling, wherever he was in the break room, was almost certainly not looking for it. She'd learned this in Helmand Province. 7 months of deployment, for extensions, the kind of routine that taught you what your body could survive when your mind refused to break. Pain was information, not emotion. Fear was data to be processed, not a signal to flee. And humiliation was just another form of noise to filter out. The break room laughter faded. Footsteps scattered. The ER resumed its normal rhythm of beeping monitors and rolling stretchers and the low murmur of medical professionals doing their work. At 10:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling passed Ashley at the main station. She was reviewing a patient's chart, her posture perfect, her attention focused entirely on the lines of data in front of her. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She simply existed in the space where he was passing through, neither obstacle nor asset, just background infrastructure. He slowed. Just slightly. "That patient in Bay 7, he said to her, his voice quiet enough that only she would hear it. "Get me the latest troponin levels." "Already drawn, doctor," Ashley said without looking up from the chart. "Results back in 4 minutes. I'll bring them to you." She returned to the chart. Dr. Sterling stood there for 3 more seconds, then moved on. This was the dance. This was the game that played out in emergency rooms across the country, in boardrooms and corporate offices and everywhere else that power collected and settled. A man testing the boundaries of another person's tolerance. Pushing to see where the breaking point was. And a woman, a nurse, just a nurse, in the language of the hierarchy, refusing to break. The worn combat boots sat in her locker, salt stains still visible on the leather, the laces knotted and reknotted from 18 years of use. Every shift, when she opened that locker to change from her civilian clothes into scrubs, she saw them there. And every shift, she closed the door without touching them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw a quiet nurse. He saw submission. He saw opportunity. He didn't see the hands that had performed needle decompression for tension pneumothorax in a field hospital, the kind of procedure that saved lives in the margins between life and death. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked exit routes, the position of her body always angled to see the door. He didn't see the way she could assess a trauma patient in 3 seconds flat and know, with absolute certainty, what needed to happen next and in what order. He saw just a nurse. And he had no idea that everything he'd built was about to be tested against exactly the kind of person who didn't break under pressure. The kind of person who broke things instead. At 11:36 a.m., as the department moved toward the lunch rush, as Dr. Sterling made his rounds and Ashley restocked the medication carts and the patients kept arriving through the automatic doors with their injuries and their fear and their hope, something was already beginning to shift. Imperceptibly. Like pressure building behind a dam. A phone would ring later. A patient would arrive. And by the time the sun set over Denver, Dr. Sterling would understand that he'd just made a very specific and very consequential mistake. But for now, in the fluorescent morning light of Sacred Heart ER, there was only the hum of machines and the quiet competence of a nurse he'd already decided to crush, moving through her work like a ghost, waiting. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as the break room filled with the morning shift. 8 nurses. 3 residents. Dr. Sterling stood by the coffee station, stirring his mug with the slow deliberation of someone about to perform. Ashley removed her jacket from her locker, movements precise and economical, the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory older than most people's careers. "I'll give her a week," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to an audience. He stared directly at Ashley, coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. "Our little mouse here doesn't have the spine for real emergency medicine. Anyone want to take that bet?" Laughter rippled through the room like a contagion, the kind of laughter that required no actual humor, only permission. A resident giggled. A nurse near the sink exchanged glances with her colleague, testing the temperature of the moment. Ashley's finger steadied on her locker door. She didn't flinch. Didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the metal surface before her, where her own reflection stared back, a ghost of herself, pale and diminished under the institutional lighting. "What do you think, Ash?" Sterling's voice dropped to that intimate, poisonous tone reserved for humiliation. "Think you can handle the pressure, or should we start the countdown now?" She took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in combat medicine courses. The kind that steadies hands before surgery. Before firefights. Before anything that required every fiber of your being to remain vertical and functional. Ashley turned. Met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, not 1, not 3. The precision mattered. It communicated that she was choosing to acknowledge him, not cowering from him. Her voice came out steady, without tremor, without apology. "I'll be here tomorrow, Dr. Sterling." She closed her locker. The sound of metal on metal hung in the sudden silence. One nurse giggled, a nervous, uncertain sound. Sterling's smirk returned, reasserting dominance, but something in his jaw had tightened. Something in the way he set down his coffee cup suggested the morning had not proceeded according to his choreography. The next day arrived with the brutal predictability of hospital shifts. Afternoon cafeteria. Fluorescent lights casting everything in that institutional yellow that made even fresh food look processed. Ashley moved through the line with the same invisible efficiency she perfected over 7 years at Sacred Heart, carrying her tray with the balance of someone trained to move through chaos without spilling precious liquids. Soup. Sandwich. Coffee. Simple things. Caloric fuel between traumas. She was 3 steps past the doctor's table when Sterling's foot extended, a casual hook, timed with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The tray didn't fall gracefully. There was nothing cinematic about it. The soup splattered across the tile in a spreading starburst pattern, the bowl spinning once before settling. Coffee erupted in a brown spray. The sandwich skidded 6 feet across the floor, leaving a paste trail. 30 people in the cafeteria turned in unison. The room didn't go silent, it held its breath. Sterling rose to his feet with the slow deliberation of a performance. He pulled her patient charts from under his arm, the manila folders crisp and accusatory, and tossed them into the spreading soup at her feet. The papers bloomed with moisture, charts beginning their dissolution into the mess. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched for the audience, not for her. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time working, you'd be more careful. Ashley dropped to one knee. The tile was cold through her scrubs. Soup soaked into the fabric along her thigh, warm and viscous, spreading in a dark stain. Her hands moved to gather the papers, the sandwich, the fragments of the bowl. A single tear escaped her left eye. Not from the humiliation. Not from the anger. Tears were a biological response to a nervous system under extreme stress, the same way pupils dilate or hands shake. They were data. Pain is data. She understood that at a cellular level. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her other hand continued gathering the saturated charts, moving with an economy of motion that suggested she'd done this before, not cleaned up cafeterias, but functioned under conditions that made a public humiliation feel almost quaint by comparison. When her voice came, it emerged from somewhere deeper than her throat. It sounded like a different person entirely. Devastatingly calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. "I've held intestines in my hands while mortars fell," she said quietly. The volume was low enough that only Sterling heard it, though the surrounding staff fell silent attempting to catch the words. "You're going to need more than that." The cafeteria froze. Not silence, fluorescent lights still hummed, a coffee maker in the corner still gurgled, someone in the distance dropped a tray with a distant metallic crash. But the social space collapsed into absolute stillness. 30 people doing the math in real time, watching Sterling's smirk falter for half a second before reasserting itself like a reflex. "Big talk from someone cleaning up lunch," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded like something he felt obligated to say rather than something he believed. Ashley continued gathering the charts, the sodden papers reluctant to lift from the tile. One nurse near the condiment station exchanged glances with another. A resident stared into his coffee cup as though it contained profound truths about institutional hierarchies he'd previously underestimated. 3 people realized simultaneously that they had fundamentally misread the woman they'd been calling timid. That night, Sterling sat alone in his office on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart, the building settling around him like a living thing. The surgical wing for floors below was quiet, post-operative recovery periods always were, the patient sedated into temporary peace. His fingers moved across his keyboard with the focus of someone engaged in specialized work. Ashley Cooper. ACPE registered nurse since 2017. RNBC. CCRN certification. All legitimate. All documented. All insufficient to explain the confidence that had emerged in the cafeteria, the precision of her medical knowledge, the way she diagnosed a tension pneumothorax before imaging could confirm it. There were gaps in her history. Employment records that listed contractors instead of hospital names. References that bounced to government voicemail systems. He picked up his desk phone and dialed. The hospital board chairman's personal line. 11 p.m. was late enough to suggest urgency without seeming hysterical. "Dr. Sterling." Twice in 1 week, the chairman's voice emerged tired but willing. The voice of power that had learned to be accessible. "What's the emergency?" "We need to talk about Ashley Cooper's background check," Sterling said, pulling her hiring file from his desk drawer. "Something doesn't add up. I need you to authorize a complete vetting. Every credential, every reference, every previous employer verified independently. Is she a safety risk?" "I'm not certain yet," Sterling said carefully. "That's what I need to find out." 30 seconds of silence on the line. The sound of a page turning. The chairman processing the request, calculating the institutional liability of ignoring it versus the administrative burden of accommodating it. "Get me a written request with specifics," the chairman said finally. "I'll authorize the audit, but I need documentation." Sterling ended the call and opened a new document on his computer. His fingers were already moving, already shaping the narrative, pulling threads from every interaction he'd witnessed. The way she moved. The medical knowledge that exceeded her pay grade. The inexplicable confidence. The reference to trauma that no Denver nurse should have experienced. He was hunting something specific now. Not incompetence. Not unprofessional conduct. Something else entirely. Meanwhile, for floors below, Ashley finished her shift at 2,200 hours. The emergency department had been mercifully quiet, a fractured wrist, 2 cases of dehydration, 1 diabetic presenting with elevated glucose. Nothing requiring more than standard protocols. Nothing that demanded the particular set of skills she'd spent 7 years trying to forget she possessed. She walked to her locker in the nurses' station break room. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in institutional white. She twisted the dial of her combination lock, 17, 34, 9, and opened the door. The combat boots sat exactly where she'd left them, tucked into the lower corner beside a spare pair of compression socks and an old fleece jacket. They were desert tan, Dana model, the leather cracked along the creases from 100 miles of patrol through terrain she no longer allowed herself to remember in detail. Her hand reached out and touched the boot's rough surface. The leather was cool and familiar and terrifying. She could smell the dust still embedded in the fabric, the ghost of Helmand Province somehow preserved in the weave. Her fingers traced the scuff marks where shrapnel had grazed the left heel. She'd been shot at while wearing these boots. She'd run through darkness carrying wounded soldiers. She'd held people together so they could reach helicopters and field hospitals and surgeries that saved their lives. She'd been decorated for it. Mentioned in official channels. Called hero by people who understood what that word actually meant. And she'd spent 7 years trying to convince herself she was just a nurse. Ashley closed her fingers around the boot one final time, then released it. She closed her locker door. The sound echoed faintly down the empty corridor. Above her, in his office, Dr. Sterling was drafting his request for background verification, not understanding that the woman he was trying to destroy had already survived things his mind couldn't quite accommodate. The night stretched out ahead of them both, one pursuing shadows in personnel files, the other carrying the weight of a secret measured in medevacs and firefights and 17 lives that hadn't made it home until she'd carried them there. Dr. Sterling's fingers moved across his desk phone at 0630 hours, the morning light slanting through his office window in precise geometric lines. Board President Victoria Chen answered on the second ring. She always did, because Sterling understood power. He understood that people like Chen didn't sleep when liability was in motion. "We have a situation," Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced concern of a man who'd solved hospital crises before. "One of our ER nurses may have falsified her credentials. Ashley Cooper. Hired 8 months ago, but her background check has gaps. I'm concerned about patient safety implications and our legal exposure." Chen's silence was the sound of institutional machinery engaging. Sterling had learned long ago that the threat of liability moved faster than facts. "What kind of gaps?" she asked. 5 years unaccounted for. 2015 to 2020. Listed as personal medical leave, but we can't verify. No employment records, no institutional affiliation. For someone in a critical care role, that's a significant red flag. "Get me a full audit," Chen said. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered through the phone line like a scalpel. Sterling ended the call and made call number 2 to Chief of Staff Dr. Marcus Whitmore, another conversation designed not to share facts but to seed suspicion in the garden where it would grow fastest. By 0900 hours, call number 3 connected him with Marcus Finn, a private investigator who specialized in background verification for hospitals. Finn had a reputation for being thorough and, more importantly, for finding what needed to be found. "I need her complete employment history cross-referenced with public records," Sterling said. "Birth certificates, tax filings, property records, anything that fills in the gaps. And I need it by end of business Friday." The file landed on Finn's desk 3 hours later. He worked methodically through the afternoon, his desk lamp casting a narrow cone of light across Ashley's paperwork. What he found was both unremarkable and suspicious in equal measure. Everything checked out on the surface, but the 5 years between 2015 and 2020 remained an absence. A void. In investigation work, voids were where secrets lived. By noon, Sterling had begun his visit to the ICU. Commander Hayes lay in bed 7, his frame diminished by pain medication and trauma, the ventilator breathing for him with its rhythmic mechanical wheeze. Sterling entered with his charts held like a shield of authority, his posture calculated to project confidence. "Commander, I'm Dr. Sterling, the attending overseeing your care. I need to ask you about the nurse who treated you in the emergency department. Ashley Cooper. Did she say anything to you? About military service, or anything outside her nursing duties?" Hayes's eyes moved behind the tube, but he couldn't answer. The ventilator hissed. Sterling waited exactly 6 seconds, long enough to suggest he expected a response, then made a note in the patient file, patient's care team to be restructured pending investigation of nursing staff credentials. Nurse A. Cooper to be reassigned away from this patient effective immediately. The signature went down in blue ink. Authority made official. What they didn't know was that by the time Sterling was making that notation, Ashley was already discovering her reassignment. The evening shift began at 1900 hours. She came through the employee entrance, badge clipped to her scrubs, and went directly to the ICU assignment board to check her patient roster. Her name wasn't there. Instead, a shift supervisor named Patricia pulled her aside in the hallway, her voice low and uncomfortable. "Sterling's orders," Patricia said, not meeting Ashley's eyes. "You're on pediatrics tonight. Different floors." Ashley didn't ask why. She didn't argue or demand explanation. She simply nodded and turned toward the stairs. But her hands felt different, heavier, as if they'd been holding something they could no longer bear. The ICU was where the commander was. The man who'd recognized something in her technique, some muscle memory translated through her fingers. When she tried to visit his room on her break, the ICU nurse turned her away with visible discomfort. "Not your patient anymore. You're not assigned." That night, at 0200 hours, something shifted in Sacred Heart's internal architecture. The fire alarm on ICU Level 3 chirped, a single electronic screech that echoed through the hallway. Then it chirped again. Someone had pulled the manual evacuation handle on the east corridor. Protocol activated. Nurses began moving patients, their movements precise and trained, the hospital transforming into controlled emergency motion. Ventilators were manually bagged. Fours were gathered. The machinery of medical evacuation engaged itself like a well-oiled mechanism. Nobody noticed the service entrance door open on the south stairwell at precisely 0204 hours. Nobody saw the two men in tactical gear and ski masks until it was too late to warn anyone quietly. They moved through the lower level with the fluid efficiency of apex predators, their weapons held low but ready, their body language suggesting they knew exactly where they were going. This wasn't confusion. This was purpose wearing combat boots. The hallway was chaos, the right kind of chaos for what they needed. Evacuation protocols meant skeleton crews, patients being moved, attention fractured. One of the ICU nurses saw them first. Her scream came out small and sharp, like a bird struck mid-flight. The men broke into a run toward bed 7, where Commander Hayes lay ventilated and defenseless. But Ashley heard that scream from 3 floors below. Her hand stopped moving. Her body recognized something her conscious mind was still processing, the sound of threat, the acoustic signature of organized violence. She was moving before her brain caught up with her body, dropping the pediatric patient chart on a desk and running toward the stairs. By the time she reached the ICU, the men had breached the trauma room. The door was locked but not secured. Hospital policy prioritized flow over fortress. It took them 2.3 seconds to force it. Hayes's monitor was alarming, his body tensing against the restraints that kept him from tearing out his own breathing tube. The first man raised his weapon. Ashley didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate. Muscle memory took over, the kind that lives in the nervous system after 1,000 firefights, after holding position under fire, after learning that the space between hesitation and action was where people died. She threw her body in front of the bed, her arms spread, a human shield for a man she barely knew. "No," she said. One word. Flat. Final. The first shot came from 3 meters away. 9mm rounds moving at 400 meters per second. The first bullet entered her left shoulder, fragmenting bone and rotator cuff. Pain wasn't information anymore, pain was only pain, immediate and consuming. She didn't fall. The second shot caught her right shoulder, entry wound the size of a dime, exit wound the size of a quarter. Blood began moving down her arm, warm and gravity-fed. But Hayes was still alive. Still protected. She reached behind her, found the panic button on the wall, and pressed it with fingers that no longer felt like her own. The third bullet came as she was falling, 0.6 seconds after the first shot, 0.4 seconds after the second. This one caught her in the left side, just above the hip, a through and through that would bleed faster than the shoulder wounds. She collapsed onto the tile floor in a spreading pool of her own blood, barely conscious, watching the world turn red at its edges. Her hands were pressed against the pressure wounds, training overriding shock. Apply pressure. Stop the bleed. Live. The hospital security team breached the room 47 seconds later. 2 officers, radios, movement. The tactical men were already moving toward the service exit. Their mission wasn't to kill the commander anymore. Their mission was extraction. But they'd failed. The angel in scrubs had bought him exactly the seconds he needed to survive. Sirens. Radio static. The voice of someone calling for a level 1 trauma activation. Ashley's world contracted to breathing, to pressure, to the cold tile against her cheek, and to the single thought that maybe, finally, someone would understand why she kept those boots in her locker. Why she'd worn the same face for so long. Why she'd chosen to hide who she was instead of letting the world see what she'd been trained to do. Her vision dimmed. The fluorescent lights above her began to blur at their edges. And somewhere far away, she heard footsteps running toward her with the speed of people who understood that time had just become the most precious resource in Sacred Heart ER. The screaming started on pediatric. Not the normal sound of a child waking from anesthesia or a father passing out at the sight of blood. This was different. This was the sound of people recognizing death walking toward them. Ashley froze at the medication cart outside Hayes' room, her hand steady on the 4 lines she'd been checking, and then she heard it, the specific rhythm of tactical boots on linoleum, the weight distribution of armed men moving in formation. 1, 2, 3, 4. That cadence. She'd heard it before. In Helmand Province, it meant incoming. In Denver, it meant something was catastrophically wrong. She didn't run toward the pediatric floor. She ran toward the ICU. Toward Hayes. The 2 men came through the double doors like they owned the moment. No hesitation. No questions. Weapons raised, suppressors threaded on the barrels, eyes locked on the commander's room at the end of the corridor. The taller one moved left, clearing corners with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. His partner moved right, weapon tracking. Ashley was 20 feet away when their eyes found her. When they realized she was going to be a problem. She didn't think. Thinking was for people with the luxury of time. Her body moved with a kind of muscle memory that 18 years of civilian life hadn't erased, couldn't erase, not when it lived in her spine and her hands and the part of her brain that had learned to make decisions in microseconds. Ashley sprinted the last dozen feet and threw herself through Hayes' doorway, her shoulder hitting the door frame hard enough to rattle her teeth. The first gunshot sounded like a cough. Suppressed. Professional. The round caught her in the left shoulder and the impact spun her halfway around, pain blooming like a detonation, but her momentum carried her toward the bed, Hayes' body, Hayes' life that she'd already saved once and would save again, not as a nurse but as a senior chief, as someone who understood that seconds were all that remained between breathing and not. She grabbed the bed rail. Pulled. The mattress beneath Hayes shifted with her weight and the bed lurched toward the wall where the red panic button gleamed like a target. The second shot came lower. It caught her right side just below the ribs and the air in her lungs became something else, something red and hot, and she gasped but didn't stop, didn't falter, just drove her legs harder, pushing 200 pounds of hospital bed and dying man toward salvation. The third round caught her in the side of the neck and she felt the heat of it, felt the burning line of it, but her hand was already slamming the panic button, slamming it hard enough to crack plastic against the wall. The alarm screamed. All of them at once. Code blue. Code red. The kind of sirens that meant the hospital was waking up in rage. Ashley's legs stopped working. She didn't remember falling, only the cold linoleum against her cheek and the spreading wet warmth beneath her that smelled like copper and fear. Her vision tunneled at the edges, the way it had in the field when you'd lost too much blood too fast and your body was making decisions about what it could afford to see. She could hear boots, heavy security boots, the rhythm different from tactical, the sound of people running to save rather than running to kill. She could see Hayes above her, one arm pulling at the fall line, his face twisted in something between rage and desperation, his mouth forming words she couldn't quite hear over the ringing in her ears. But she could read his lips. Stay with me, Senior Chief. That's an order. Stay with me. She wanted to tell him that orders didn't work that way anymore, that she was just a nurse, just a person who had tried to be small enough to be invisible. She wanted to explain that the blood pooling around her was the price of running, the cost of pretending to be something other than what she was. But her mouth wouldn't work and her eyes were closing and the last thing she saw was Hayes's face, alive, terrified, breathing, before the darkness took everything. She woke 18 hours later in a patient bed 3 floors down. Shoulder reconstructed with orthopedic pins and surgical wire. Right side packed with gauze and surgical drains. 17 units of blood that wasn't hers running through her veins like borrowed time. The pain existed in a distant way, like something happening to someone else, dulled by drugs that made her thoughts drift like paper boats in dark water. Dylan was asleep in the visitor's chair beside her, his head tilted at an angle that would make his neck scream when he woke up. 16 years old. Still believing his mother was just a hospital nurse. Still thinking she'd been hit by some freak accident, some random act, not the price of being who she actually was. Ashley wanted to tell him to go home, to stop sitting vigil over a mother who'd just proven that anonymity was a lie they couldn't afford anymore. But she couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stare at his face and feel the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The nurse came at 2:13 p.m., according to the wall clock. Not one of Ashley's colleagues. Someone from HR, Ashley realized, when the woman's expression shifted from sympathy to something harder, something official. The paperwork came first, then the words, delivered with the kind of careful distance that meant legal review. Ms. Cooper, I'm sorry, but I need you to sign these. You've been terminated effective immediately. Dr. Sterling filed a complaint alleging unauthorized security engagement and violation of patient care protocols. The board voted this morning. Your badge is being deactivated as of close of business. The termination letter sat on the bed rail like a knife. The words blurred. Unauthorized security engagement. Violation of protocol. As if saving a patient's life and taking 3 bullets for it was something that required an HR apology. Dylan woke up. Saw the paperwork. His eyes went wide in a way that broke something in her chest. Mom, what is that? Ashley signed with her left hand, right arm locked in an immobilizer, her signature shaky but present. It's okay, baby. The lie tasted like blood. 3 days later, she walked into the Denver Veterans Affairs Hospital waiting room as a patient, not staff. The intake coordinator glanced at her without recognition and handed her a clipboard. PTSD evaluation, veteran's name. Ashley Cooper. The waiting room was full of ghosts. 20 chairs. 20 versions of the same 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in mirrors and held in dark rooms. A man across from her wore a Helmand Province unit patch on his jacket. Another wore the scars of an IED survivor on his left hand, fingers gone, skin grafted and grafted again. A third sat so still he barely seemed to breathe. Ashley stared at the linoleum floor. The scuffs. The stains. The landscape of a place where people came to stop falling apart and discovered they didn't remember how to put themselves back together. Her shoulder throbbed. Her side burned. The intake coordinator called her name like she was reading it off a list of strangers, which, to the system, was exactly what she was. Just a patient. Just another broken veteran sitting in a waiting room full of the broken, all of them wondering if running from who they were had finally destroyed who they'd tried to become. She stared at her hands. They were the same hands that had held intestines while mortars fell, that had performed needle decompression for tension pneumothorax in a Helmand Province field hospital at 0300 hours while rounds came through the tent walls. The same hands that had pushed a hospital bed toward a panic button and taken 3 bullets for a man who'd already survived too much. The same hands that had signed away her career 10 minutes ago because she'd been stupid enough to believe that quiet efficiency was enough to disappear. The waiting room clock ticked forward. 1:14 p.m. Ashley closed her eyes and waited for what came next. The waiting room at the VA hospital in Baltimore smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Ashley sat in a plastic chair, her shoulder throbbing beneath the fresh bandage, her left side wrapped tight enough that breathing took concentration. 3 days since Sacred Heart terminated her. 3 days since she'd taken 3 bullets protecting a man whose name she still wouldn't say out loud. The paperwork in her lap listed her as a patient now, not staff. The irony tasted like copper. A nurse called her name, different hospital, same fluorescent hum overhead. Ashley stood slowly, favoring her right side, and followed the woman down a corridor lined with men and women in various states of dissolution. Some stared at nothing. Some stared at her. She recognized the look. She'd worn it herself for years. That's when the phone in her pocket buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Senior Chief Cooper. A man's voice. Clipped. Military bearing even through the phone line. This is Admiral James Holloway, United States Coast Guard. I need you to listen very carefully. Your identity was just made public. The Department of Defense is currently en route to your location with full medical clearance and direct orders. Your son Dylan broke into a storage unit this morning. He found your service records. The hallway tilted. Ashley's free hand gripped the wall. Where is he? Her voice came out flat. Professional. The mask dropping away without her permission. In Denver. At Sacred Heart Hospital. He walked into the administrator's office 47 minutes ago with a box of your medals. We're moving fast, but you need to know what's happening before the media catches it. The line went dead. Everything accelerated after that. A black Suburban pulled into the VA parking lot. 2 men in dress uniforms stepped out. They didn't ask permission, they simply took her arm gently and guided her toward the vehicle. She didn't resist. Resistance was a luxury people with secrets could afford. She had none left. The hospital in Denver smelled like disinfectant and possibility when she arrived. A Coast Guard flag hung from the front entrance, new. Recent. Her doing, somehow, though she couldn't have known it. Admiral Holloway walked her through the main corridor with the kind of presence that made hospital staff flatten themselves against the walls. His uniform carried more medals than most people accumulated in lifetimes. He moved like a man accustomed to giving orders that changed the course of nations. The administrator's office was on the 3rd floor. Through the glass partition, she could see them, Dylan, her boy, now 16 and built like someone who'd spent the last 3 days moving heavy things. He wore a hoodie she'd bought him 2 years ago. His hands were shaking as he emptied a cardboard box onto the conference table. The medals caught the light. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. 3 combat action ribbons. The physical evidence of everything she'd spent 6 years hiding. Dr. Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face the color of old beef. He'd been caught mid-smirk when the first medal hit the mahogany. Now he looked like a man watching his career collapse in real time. "That's my mother," Dylan said, his voice cracking across the syllables like he was learning to speak. He held up a service record. The paper shook in his hands, but his voice grew stronger. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, United States Coast Guard. 3 tours. Helmand Province. She didn't quit because you're mean, Dr. Sterling. She quit because you're nothing." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like applause. A man stepped forward from the back of the room. Late 40s, face scarred, eyes that had seen the worst and decided to see the best anyway. Navy SEAL, the bearing unmistakable as gunfire. His uniform carried insignia that made Sterling's face go from beef red to chalk white. Senior Chief Cooper holds 3 combat action ribbons and personally saved 17 lives under fire in Helmand Province, the SEAL said, his voice steady as a surgical laser. "She's the reason Commander Hayes is still breathing. She's the reason 17 families still have fathers, brothers, sons. You should be thanking her. Instead, you tried to destroy her." Sterling's lawyer stood up. The SEAL didn't look at him. Didn't need to. The doors burst open. 3 FBI agents in tactical vests. The lead agent, Martinez, according to her nameplate, approached the table with the casual authority of someone accustomed to making powerful people disappear. "Dr. David Sterling, we have probable cause to believe you altered personnel records, falsified incident reports, and attempted to obstruct a federal investigation into the shooting at this facility." She pulled out a folder thick as a textbook. "You changed Ashley Cooper's performance reviews after the fact. Changed exemplary to adequate. Added complaints from staff members who never filed them. You contacted her previous employer in Montana and attempted to plant false information about her departure. You submitted a falsified incident report claiming she violated patient safety protocols when she actually saved Captain Hayes' life." Sterling started talking. Fast. Desperate. His mouth moving like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The words tumbled over each other, incoherent, the vocabulary of a man who'd spent his life hiding behind titles and hadn't learned how to speak plainly. The board members around the table stopped looking at him. They looked at their hands. At the door. Anywhere but at the man whose power had just evaporated in the time it took to open a cardboard box. Martinez snapped the handcuffs on with a sound like destiny. The metal closed around Sterling's wrists with a finality that seemed to silence even the rain. She read him his rights in a voice without inflection, then guided him toward the door. He walked through the corridor that had been his kingdom just an hour before, his face purple, veins bulging at his temples, spittle at the corner of his mouth. "This is a mistake," he kept saying. "I'm a physician. You can't treat me like..." The elevator doors closed on the sound of his own voice. The emergency board meeting convened that afternoon. Investigator Finn presented his complete findings in the tone of a man delivering a verdict that had already been decided. The board voted unanimously to terminate Sterling's privileges. The state medical board was notified. The prosecutor's office prepared charges. 3 months later, his medical license was suspended pending criminal proceedings. 6 months after that, he was convicted on 2 federal counts of falsification of federal documents and obstruction. 18 months in federal prison. 3 years probation. His wife filed for divorce during the trial. The country club revoked his membership. Friends stopped answering his calls. 1 year later, Sterling sat at a folding table in a strip mall between a nail salon and a vape shop, making cold calls about auto insurance policies. The table squeaked every time he shifted his weight. The smell of nail polish remover drifted through the thin walls. He made $32,000 a year. At night, he Googled Ashley Cooper's name and found articles about the new combat medic training program at Bethesda. 2 years after the shooting, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper stood before a class of 30 combat medic trainees in dress uniform at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The worn combat boots from her Sacred Heart locker sat on a shelf in her office now, beside her medals and a photograph of Commander Hayes, recovered, promoted to captain, running Coast Guard Special Operations training. Her hands were steady. Her voice was clear. Dylan sat in the front row in Coast Guard recruit uniform. He'd enlisted 6 months ago, inspired by finally knowing who his mother actually was. After her lecture on tension pneumothorax recognition and needle decompression, delivered with the authority of someone who'd performed the procedure under fire, he waited while she answered questions from other students, then followed her to her office. A letter sat on her desk. Sacred Heart Hospital letterhead. A formal apology. An invitation to speak at their annual medical conference. Notification that the emergency department training bay had been renamed the Senior Chief Ashley Cooper Trauma Suite. Ashley set the letter down and picked up the framed photograph of her old unit in Helmand Province. 20 faces. Some alive. Some not. Her hands didn't shake anymore. She didn't flinch at loud noises. The PTSD hadn't vanished, but she'd learned to carry it differently now, with her head up instead of hiding from it. Dylan stood in the doorway, watching his mother in uniform, finally understanding the weight she'd carried alone. "What's next?" he asked. "Training," Ashley said quietly. "These kids need to know what it means to be strong when everything's breaking. They need to understand that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everyone together." She paused, then added with the faintest edge of dry humor, "And I need to stop hiding combat boots in lockers." That night, she drove to the VA hospital in Baltimore and volunteered in the PTSD support group she'd once attended as a patient. She sat among veterans, some broken, some healing, all of them carrying weight that civilians would never understand. No longer hiding. No longer running. Just present. The rain hammered against the windows of the training facility as her next class arrived. 30 new faces. 30 new stories. 30 new chances to teach someone that surviving isn't weakness. That asking for help isn't surrender. That the person you're standing next to might have already walked through hell and come out the other side stronger. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who change everything. Like this video and comment, have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value? Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark.